on the 26th of October 1440, in a field outside the city of Nantes in the Duchy of Brittany, Gilles de Rais, the Baron of Rais, stood on a platform above a vast, silent crowd. Before them all, the great lord fell to his knees, folded his hands together, and begged for God's mercy. Beneath the platform, a mound of timber lay ready to be ignited. From the gallows above his head dangled the rope that would soon be placed about his neck. Once he had been one of the wealthiest men in the world, owning dozens of castles throughout the richest lands of Brittany, Maine and Anjou. He was a war hero and a Marshal of France who fought alongside Joan of Arc to drive out the hated English invaders, helping to win the throne for King Charles VII. But Gilles de Rais had long harboured a darkness in his soul. During his scandalous trial, he had confessed to the most terrible crimes imaginable. The court would hear stories of alchemy and demon summoning, accusations of heresy, and the admission that the great lord and his accomplices had abducted, abused, and murdered countless children. But how did he spiral so completely out of control? How was he finally caught and prosecuted? And what about those who claim that he was, in fact, an innocent man, framed by a conspiracy of powerful lords who wanted his wealth for themselves? This is the shocking story of the famous knight, wealthy baron, and serial killer Gilles de Rais. This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. This channel relies on the support of these generous people. If you enjoy these videos, please join us on Patreon to access exclusive content and to ensure I can keep making videos like this in future. Thank you. Gilles de Rais was born in about 1404 or 5, supposedly in the Black Tower of the castle of Champtocé on the banks of the Loire. His parents were Gilles de Rais and Marie de Craon, who were second cousins, both part of an aristocratic clan that spread its influence across what is northwest France today, especially in Brittany, Anjou, Maine and Poitou. The union of Guy and Marie made them heirs to enormous fortunes that would pass to Gilles on their deaths. And both his parents had died by 1415, when Gilles was about 10 or 11 years old. His father Guy was gored by a wild boar when out hunting, and then he slowly died, likely due to an infection. Presumably, this was a traumatic period in Gilles' early life, which influenced the formation of his character. Some speculate that losing the moderating influence of his father started him on the road to uncontrollable madness. But Gilles himself claimed that he had always been raised as a spoiled boy. Gilles had a brother, René, who is commonly said to be 2 or 3 years younger. However, it's possible that he was in fact 10 years younger, and perhaps complications from his birth were responsible for their mother's death. We don't really know what happened to her though. She just isn't mentioned in any records after 1414 or so. Either way, the boys were not close, and René does not appear much in the story of Gilles' life, so perhaps he was in fact far younger. And not only were they not close, they were rather adversarial. Years later, René began legal proceedings to stop Gilles selling off the family's holdings to pay the enormous debts the older brother had accrued. Anyway, after they were orphaned in 1415, they were then raised by their maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon. 1415 is a famous date in French history because of their devastating, humiliating defeat at the Battle of Agincourt. And when Jean de Craon's son, Gilles' uncle, was killed at Agincourt, he made his grandson his heir instead. This made Gilles the heir to his father's titles and estates, and now those of his maternal grandfather. At around 11 years old, Gilles had become one of the wealthiest heirs in France. As he was a child, however, all this wealth, the titles and the lands and castles that came with them, remained in the control of his grandfather until Gilles came of age at 20. Now, Jean de Craon is generally seen as one of the villains of this story. In fact, some see him as a monstrous figure who proved a terrible, corrupting influence on young Gilles. One biographer calls Jean de Craon, quote, rapacious, avaricious, greedy, and unscrupulous, end quote. They say the old lord was a thug who believed himself above the law, a lord who used his henchmen to bully and threaten rivals and subjects, to extract wealth and to further his political interest. And there's no doubt he was a high-level political operator, dedicated to advancing his own wealth and influence through political bargains with his peers, subjects, and the royal family. He was ruthless and yet cunning, able to give way and to compromise when it was in his interests. And yet he also went beyond the law when he could get away with it. There are multiple accounts of him kidnapping other nobles, men and women, and holding them captive to further his political and financial aims. And it would be exactly this kind of behaviour that would lead to Gilles' downfall years later. Where Jean de Craon knew when to back down, Gilles de Rais never learned to compromise. In 1415, when Gilles' father, Guy de Laval, was dying, he made arrangements for a different guardian for his children and their fortune. So Guy did not want Jean de Craon to control his children and their fortune, but it wasn't long after his death before Jean took over. As the guardian of Gilles and his brother René, he was responsible for their upbringing and education. Like all noblemen of the era, Gilles was raised to be a knight and a lord. His tutors instructed him in reading and writing French and Latin. He needed to understand the law and the administration of his lands, and his religious education was vital. His first tutors were both priests, one with a degree in law. But warfare and violence were a nobleman's primary responsibilities, and so he was trained in horsemanship, the sword and other weapons, armoured wrestling, and the whole business of fighting. And France had been at war for a long time against the English, but now it was also at war with itself. The mad king Charles VI had often experienced bouts of severe psychosis, and the lack of leadership led to a civil war amongst the French nobility. After the devastating English invasion that culminated in the 1415 Battle of Agincourt, Charles eventually, in 1420, made Henry V of England his successor and gave his daughter in marriage to the victorious English king, disinheriting his 17-year-old son, the Dauphin Charles. Complicating matters, the great Henry V and the mad King Charles VI would both die in 1422. Henry V's son and Charles VI's grandson, the infant Henry VI of England, would be crowned King of France. Unsurprisingly, the former Dauphin Charles sought to gain the throne he believed was his, and soon the kingdom was divided between lands controlled by the English and those loyal to Charles. In 1422, Gilles was about 17 years old and was still under the control of his grandfather. They were focused on using the instability and shifting loyalties of the era to further their own local political interests. Gilles de Rais is closely associated with the Duchy of Brittany because he had inherited or later married into estates there. The Barony of Rais was in the far south of Brittany, but he also had lands in counties within the royal domain of France, so his overlords were both the Duke of Brittany and the King of France. John V, the Duke of Brittany at this time, is an important character in the story of Gilles de Rais. He was the man ultimately responsible for Gilles' arrest and prosecution, and those who argue that Gilles was in fact innocent point to Duke Jean as the true villain. And Brittany was an important, powerful duchy. In the decades before Gilles' birth, at the start of what we call the 100 Years' War, the War of the Breton Succession became a proxy war between the kings of England and France. The prize was the Duchy of Brittany itself, and it had been won by the English-backed Montfort faction. The Duke now was John V of the House of Montfort. While his father and grandfather had relied on English support, John V played both sides for his own ends. It was in this period of shifting alliances, disorder and skirmishing that Gilles de Rais began his career as a soldier, first in local skirmishes and then against the English. In 1427, his rather elderly grandfather, Jean de Craon, was appointed Lieutenant General of Anjou, and as the role entailed levying and leading troops in battle, it was Gilles, aged about 22, who actually took command. And he employed some of his great wealth to raise 5 companies of soldiers. For the rest of the war, he was ever surrounded by a retinue of well-equipped, magnificently clad men-at-arms, especially 3 veteran knights who served as his military advisors. All his men he kept well supplied and well paid, which ensured their effectiveness in battle and their loyalty to him as their captain. In his first campaign, he took 3 towns and 2 castles from the English and their local allies. At the siege of Lude, after the cannon had blasted the walls, the signal was given to attack the garrison. It was a well-defended place, protected by a veteran garrison under a Captain Blackburn. After charging across the open ground beneath the walls and scaling the breach, Gilles de Rais was the first atop the wall. There he fought Captain Blackburn in single combat while the battle raged around them. Gilles de Rais cut down his enemy and the English morale was broken. It was a heroic victory, won through his remarkable personal bravery. This was an era where taking prisoners and ransoning them for cash was the norm. Indeed, it was an important source of income, especially for the less wealthy men. After this victory, Gilles de Rais ransomed the English prisoners, but to the disappointment of his men, he had all the French captives executed. Some biographers accuse Gilles de Rais of recklessness in this attack, and likewise these executions are seen as an early outward sign of his secret, bloodthirsty nature. It's more likely, though, that this was a calculated political move intended to frighten potential future collaborators. Flushed with victory, Gilles then attempted to take the town of Le Mans from the English, but they were repulsed by the garrison led by one of the greatest soldiers of the age, John Talbot, still early in his career in France. Though he failed to take Le Mans, Gilles de Rais returned from his campaign in triumph. He had made a name for himself on the battlefield and demonstrated that he was willing and able to employ his vast wealth in support of the Dauphin Charles and his efforts to win the throne. Gilles is said to have cut a dashing figure at the relatively impoverished court, and he was the only man amongst the courtiers rich enough to maintain a private army. As the biographer Jean Benedetti says, quote, "He was very popular at court. He was handsome, gay and witty, and he dressed better than anyone else." End quote. However, we have no idea what he looked like. There are no known contemporary portraits or descriptions. There are some near-contemporary images, but they are works of imagination. The most famous painting depicting him is from the 19th century. Whatever he looked like, he was young and making a name for himself as a soldier. He had attached himself to the cause of the disinherited prince, a cause which to many seemed doomed to failure. But now a miracle was coming. Gilles' life would become entwined with that of the saviour of France, the Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc. The English and their allies controlled the lands north of the Loire, while the supporters of Charles controlled the south. It was a strategic stalemate, but the English decided to win the war by taking the stronghold of Orleans and then pushing south beyond the Loire to drive Charles out of his court in Bourges. It was a bold strategy, but if successful, the weak Charles, still known as the Dauphin, or more disparagingly as the King of Bourges, would have seen his support crumble forever. And in late 1428, the English marched unopposed to Orleans and began their siege. In February the next year, an attempt was made to relieve the town by an army of French and Scots, who fell upon an English supply column which was bringing ammunition and barrels of herring for the besieging army. Under attack, the English circled their wagons and then defeated the combined French-Scottish forces at what would be called the Battle of the Herrings. By the way, this battle and the Siege of Orleans feature in my novel Vampire Heretic, The Immortal Night Chronicles Book 5, which is about Gilles de Rais, his crimes and his trial, and Joan of Arc. If you'd like to read it or listen to it on audiobook, there's a link in the video description. The utter failure to relieve the siege was a terrible blow to French morale. Like in so much of the 100 Years' War, the French lacked clear leadership. There were many powerful dukes and great lords with their own contingents, and all of them wanted to be the overall commander in any particular engagement. They all wanted to be the great hero to save France, and so none of them were. And after this debacle, most of the French commanders abandoned Orleans to its fate. The would-be king, Charles, was with his court at Chinon, well aware of the situation, but doing nothing about the inevitable outcome. France needed a miracle. And that's exactly what it got. The court had word that a young woman was coming, a maiden inspired by God, who had declared that she would raise the siege of Orleans and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims Cathedral. When Joan was first brought into the court, Charles posed as one of his courtiers, and yet the maid somehow recognised him at once. There is a legend that during this dramatic scene, Gilles de Rais was the one seated on the throne, looking every bit the prince. However, while he was indeed at the court, this part is likely a later invention. The relationship between the evil Gilles de Rais and the saintly Maid of Orleans has been much embellished by legend and imagination. But it's true that Gilles was in overall command of the army that accompanied her to Orléans along with cartloads of supplies. A few days later there was an impromptu attack on the English defences. The townsfolk had been driven into a righteous fury by the maid's presence, and while she was taking a nap, they charged the English lines. Of course, they were slaughtered and pushed back by an English counterattack. When Joan awoke and rode out, she led an attack on the English. Another English force was sent out, trapping Joan and her company between the two prongs. Sometimes Joan of Arc has been praised for her military brilliance, but really she had none. She had ridden straight into danger with no thought of the consequences and was about to be killed or captured. But Gilles de Rais, alerted to the sudden bizarre skirmish going on outside the walls, assembled the company and rode out to attack the English. Now it was the English forces who were caught between two prongs, and they chose to retreat. In the disorder, they left one of their siege forts poorly defended, and it was taken by the French. A complete disaster had been averted by Gilles' decisive actions. Gilles and the other captains recognised the maid's effect on morale, but her military incompetence led her to being excluded from the Council of War held the next day, even though they held it in the house she was lodged in. They decided that they would not follow up their small victory. Not only that, but they would also bar the gates so the foolish townsfolk would not throw their lives away again. Joan railed against them, and the next day led a pitiful attack against the strong English fort beyond the walls. She stood in her armour before the fort and planted her flag with a small band of inexperienced men, destined to fail once more. But once more it was Gilles de Rais who rode out in support of her. After him, the French gradually grew in numbers and overwhelmed the English in the fort. After this victory, the captains once again urged delay and consolidation of what they had won. But Joan had found an ally in Gilles de Rais. She had no mind for politicking and strategy. All she understood was relentless attack and blind faith in victory. This attitude must have appealed to the reckless, bloodthirsty, narcissistic Gilles de Rais. The next day, they attacked another fort together, with the French forces trying to scale the walls. Joan was shot in the shoulder by a crossbow. Apparently, Gilles caught her, removed her a safe distance, and helped to remove her armour so the wound could be dressed. It should have been a terrible injury, but Joan was convinced she could not die until her mission was completed, and so she soon returned with Gilles to the fight. The masses of inspired Frenchmen overwhelmed the English fortress, and they won a great victory. The English were baffled and disturbed by the sudden change in fortunes. The French had been driven into a frenzy by a maiden dressed in armour who was clearly in league with the devil. The English army packed up and abandoned the siege of Orléans. Gilles was amongst the leaders, perhaps foremost amongst them, who accompanied Joan back to the Dauphin Charles. She had delivered him the victory she promised, and now she urged him to be crowned king at Reims. But the victory at Orléans was more symbolic than strategic. Nothing had really changed. The English still controlled the north, and it would take a full campaign to win it back. In the Loire campaign that followed, Gilles was present at the capture of Jargeau and at the great French victory at Patay. When Charles went to be crowned at Reims, Gilles de Rais was one of the commanders of the vanguard of the royal army. During the coronation, Gilles was given the great honour and responsibility, along with 3 other lords, to bring the holy ampulla with its sacred oil for the anointing of the king. On the same day, Gilles de Rais was proclaimed a Marshal of France in recognition of his support for the king. He was not the greatest of the military leaders, or the most experienced, but he was perhaps the wealthiest, and he was willing to spend his fortune to support Charles. He was also from a region that Charles wanted to exert his control over. The title bestowed more honour than actual power. However, the new marshal also began to sit on the royal council from the year 1429. Records show that he only joined the council every now and then. One gets the sense that his positions were largely honorary, and he was never that close to the inner circle of the royal faction. Perhaps his character flaws were apparent to the great men of the realm, or perhaps he preferred to spend his time indulging other pursuits. After the coronation, the royal army advanced on Paris. During a standoff with the Anglo-Burgundian army, Gilles de Rais was given command of a wing of the royal army, but there was no battle. The enemy retreated and the French advanced on Paris. During the attack on the city, Joan requested that Gilles fight alongside her once again, and that he did, fighting in the great press to cross the siege works into the city. But Joan was wounded, and the attack was defeated. The newly crowned King of France retreated from Paris and disbanded his army. He preferred to negotiate his way to a political solution. Joan's fanaticism and warmongering were not only no longer needed, they were an obstruction, even an embarrassment to Charles. The maid and her family were ennobled by the king as thanks, but she was then sidelined. The Maid of Orleans, however, was not willing to support peace and attacked the Burgundians with a force of incompetent volunteers. She was captured and moved from castle to castle. At one point, she leapt from a window of the tower she was locked in and smacked into the dry moat below. Her captors found her injured and carried her back inside. Soon they sold her to the English, and she was tried by a French bishop in an ecclesiastical court. While she was in prison in Rouen over the winter of 1430, Gilles de Rais was in a small town just a few miles away. He was there with a company of soldiers, and it's been suggested he was preparing a rescue attempt. If that's true, for whatever reason it was not carried out. Gilles went home, and on the 30th of May 1431 she was burned at the stake for being a lapsed heretic. The Maid of Orleans might have been the only female Gilles was ever really close to. How he felt about the death of his former comrade in arms, we don't know, but it's from this time that Gilles starts to become more publicly unhinged. Many changes occur one after the other, and his life turns from one of glory, fame and virtue to darkness, disgrace and sin. Gilles' grandfather Jean de Craon had sought suitable marriages for his heir that would strengthen their dynasty politically and financially. One proposed union, when Gilles was still a boy, was to the niece of Jean V of Brittany, but it seems the girl died before it could take place. Eventually though, Gilles married his fourth cousin, Catherine. The girl's family opposed the union, and it was illegal without dispensation from the church due to their blood relationship. But in 1420, when Gilles was about 15 or 16, he rode to her castle with a party of men under orders from his grandfather and kidnapped Catherine. A week later, they were married in a remote chapel. As you might imagine, there was strong objection from Catherine's family and the church. The marriage was declared null and void, but after much politicking, the union was made official and legal 2 years later. Through acts like these, Jean de Craon taught his protégé Gilles de Rais that it was best to act first and negotiate later. Later in life, Gilles would certainly learn to abduct people for his own ends, but he was never inclined to negotiate. Gilles seems to have shown little interest in women throughout his life. He spent almost no time with Catherine, and their first and only child, Marie, was born 9 years after their marriage in 1429. And Catherine and Marie lived quite apart from Gilles for the rest of his life. From the moment Gilles had control of his finances, he had begun spending wildly, and especially from 1427, he used his wealth to fund his military pursuits. As well as equipping soldiers, supplying them, and paying their salaries, he also funded spies or scouts to keep track of enemy movements, and paid or loaned money for the ransoming of his allies. Most of a great lord's wealth was in the land he had rights to. These provided annual incomes, as did taxes and fees imposed on merchants and trade crossing his lands, but even so, there wasn't enough cash coming in to pay his enormous expenses. To get the coin, he borrowed money, and to pay his debts, in 1430 he sold one of his castles. His grandfather was elderly by now, but he was driven into a rage. His life's work had been the addition of ever more lands into the family's holdings, making them wealthier even than kings, and now his witless young heir was throwing it all away. Jean de Craon purchased back the castle, but still the old lord must have been doubting the wisdom of his choice of heir. But Gilles had learned a lot from his grandfather. Now back in his homeland after the king's truce and the execution of Joan of Arc, Gilles de Rais took up banditry. Legal documents describe how he would hold up merchants and travellers on the roads through his lands, stealing their belongings. Even the great Yolande d'Aragon, mother-in-law of the King of France and the architect of his victories, was not safe. Gilles and his men attacked part of her escort and stole their horses and some of her baggage. Gilles also at this time took possession of a castle belonging to another lord and abducted and imprisoned the man who owned it. In 1432, he went to war for the last time and won a great victory by relieving the siege of Lagny-sur-Marne. On his return to his castle at Champtocé, he found his grandfather dying. The old man pointedly left his sword and breastplate to the younger grandson René as a public gesture of his displeasure with Gilles. But with the old man's death, there was no one to restrain Gilles de Rais. In his later confession, Gilles states that his assaults on children started at this time. The war was over for now, and the king wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, due to Gilles' close association with the heretical Joan of Arc, to whom Charles embarrassingly owed his kingdom, the king would rather have nothing to do with him at all. But the king also had to crack down on the tradition of banditry that had grown in the chaos of the Long War, and so Gilles had to curtail those activities too. But he owned 24 estates, and of those there were 6 castles that he preferred to live in. He was rich enough to indulge any whim. His wife had no influence over him, and his brother was little more than an annoyance, even a rival. But the few cousins he called friends were a part of his inner circle of depravity. Over the next few years, he had 2 cousins, Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Briqueville, and 2 servants, Poitou and a man called Henriette, to procure boys for him. He also abused the boys who sang in his choir, and he had 2 of these older boys help him to procure more. Accounts recorded in the trial documents relate how this was done. For example, an apprentice boy might be asked to take a message to the castle, and the boy would never return. Another account tells of a boy being offered a servant's role in one of the castles and never being seen again. Sometimes children begging at the castle gates would be taken. There were also women servants who helped, roaming the countryside, procuring lone children by luring them away. One old woman in particular, named Perrine Martin, came to be known amongst the local communities as the Terror. I'm not going to relate what happened to these children once abducted, but suffice it to say they were ultimately murdered. The court transcripts can be found in Georges Bataille's book The Trial of Gilles de Rais if you really must know the details, but I don't recommend it. It seems incredible that Gilles de Rais could convince so many accomplices to help in his terrible crimes, but the man was like a prince over the part of the world that he ruled, and he created a world fit for a prince. From the outside, the high walls of his castles were grim, but inside they were filled with fine furniture, paintings, statues, gold and silver ornaments, books and precious manuscripts. One of his chapels was given a painted ceiling with stained glass windows of the highest quality. Other rooms were hung with magnificent cloth of gold. Those who claim Gilles de Rais was framed due to a conspiracy of his enemies point out that any other lord with such a passion for interior decoration would be championed as a patron of the arts, and it's only thanks to our prejudice that we see anything sinister in such extravagance. Well, charity is a virtue, but his lavish spending was shocking to his contemporaries, and it seems to me like a kind of mania. He moved from castle to castle throughout each year and kept an open house to anyone, nobles and commoners, residents and visitors alike. The tables were always laid and anyone could find food and drink there. It was recorded that he sometimes gave away so much that there was nothing left for himself. He might give away entire liveries consisting of 100 separate garments to total strangers for no apparent reason. One of his famous expenditures was the foundation of a grand chapel called the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. The name refers to the biblical story of Herod the Great ordering the execution of young boys, and the event was commemorated annually in Christendom with the Feast of the Holy Innocents. The name, of course, takes on a twisted and sinister meaning, considering the crimes of this chapel's patron. He poured an enormous amount of money into the building and its ornamentation, and to the administration of its services. He employed around 50 people, including the servants. There was a dean, choir boys, archdeacons, and a schoolmaster for the boys, and all of them wore lavish outfits that Gilles de Rais designed himself. It was as grand and expensive as a cathedral, but it was done without reference to the church authorities. Gilles de Rais' relatives, appalled at the expense and hubris of it, appealed to the Pope, who refused to recognise the dean's position. The Baron ignored the Pope, and the head of the chapel continued to use the title and style of a bishop. By 1434, he had used up so much cash that when the king called on him to raise an army and bring troops, Gilles objected that he had no money to do so. To fulfill his obligations to the crown, he took a vast loan and sent his brother René with the army it paid for, while he went home to indulge his other interests. And in 1435 he travelled in a great procession and enormous expense to Orléans, where he would carry out one of the most extraordinary events of the age. He organised and funded a vast mystery play that would be performed repeatedly in the town over the next few months. It's difficult to express the scale of this undertaking. No one had seen its like before, nor would they again. Every year since the coming of Joan of Arc, the people of Orléans had commemorated the lifting of the siege, but it was a small, quiet remembrance. The play that Gilles put on was a reenactment of the relief of Orléans and a celebration of Joan of Arc. It had 20,000 lines of verse and contained 140 speaking parts and called for up to 500 extras. All these required costumes to be made and stages with scenery to be built. These people and the hordes of visitors had to be provided with lodgings and enormous quantities of food and drink, all paid for by Gilles de Rais. It was a grand public performance, free to anyone, and it was more like a festival. Gilles spared no expense, and again it was extravagant beyond belief. He insisted that the entire cast have brand new costumes for every single performance. To make costumes of rags, he even had expensive new cloth slashed to ribbons. What's perhaps most extraordinary of all is the fact that the Baron was almost bankrupt already. The value of his lands had made him perhaps the wealthiest man in Christendom, and yet his rampant spending knew no limits. As soon as his grandfather was dead, he had begun selling property, often for well below its market value. He sold to other lords and even tradesmen and merchants. Some of these wealthy commoners were also providing him loans. By this point, he had sold off all his estates in Poitou and Maine, and had only 2 castles left in Anjou. His relatives were incensed and tried to stop him by every legal means they had. But he was a law unto himself, and soon he was reduced to selling and pawning his own magnificent personal possessions. Almost all the cash raised went to fund his chapel or the vast play at Orléans. In fact, his agents were desperately selling and seeking loans throughout the duration of the festival so that it could continue. His sin here was not greed, but neither was this behaviour a manifestation of the virtue of charity. The manic squandering of his inheritance was instead the sin of gluttony, a willful profligacy that was entirely self-destructive. When he left Orléans for home, massively more in debt, his behaviour grew even more unhinged. For a solution to the problems caused by his insanity, he was driven to indulge in alchemy and demon summoning. Faced with an ever-worsening financial crisis, the virtuous course of action would have been to address the problem by making savings and seeking more income. Gilles de Rais, however, was not a diligent man. As usual, he chose the sinful path. In 1436 or so, he, by chance, met an imprisoned heretic who lent him a grimoire, which is a book of spells and incantations and rituals and the like. In the Baron's growing insanity and desperation, this sparked the mad hope that magic might be the answer to his problems. He first had a goldsmith brought to him who claimed some knowledge of alchemy. Gilles gave the man a silver coin and told the man to turn it into gold. The man swore he would and locked himself away in a room where he proceeded to get drunk and fall asleep. Despite this failure, the Baron was determined to find someone who could help him. Indeed, it became an obsession. He had one of his priests, Eustache Blanchet, track down a series of practitioners. Some were experts in summoning spirits and demons that would, upon their appearance, have helped Gilles de Rais with his problems, for example by revealing the location of hidden treasures, initiating him into magical arts, procuring great honours, and permitting him to take and hold castles and cities. Other men were alchemists, who swore they could turn base metals into gold to pay his debts. Of course, all these charlatans were also fleecing him for as much as they could before they were turfed out for their failure to deliver. There was one man, however, who was so cunning and who exerted so much control over the Baron that he was never kicked out despite all his failures. This was a priest, really a clerk in minor orders, called François Prelati, who was brought from Italy by Blanchet due to his expertise in these matters. He was given a special room in one of the castles in which to conduct his experiments, and together with the Baron conducted the dark ceremonies. Prelati had learned from his own master how to summon demons, and had previously made contact with a demon named Baron. This demon, they hoped, would do the Lord's bidding and solve his problems primarily by finding him wealth. The priest and his new master attempted to summon this demon through complex rituals in the hall of the castle for days on end. They made a circle on the floor and placed ritual objects within and drew certain signs on the walls. On another occasion, the demon appeared to Prelati and filled a closed room in the castle with gold, which Gilles de Rais was allowed to see through a crack in the door, although the Lord was instructed that he could not touch it yet. Gilles, however, burst into the room and discovered that the gold was fake. He believed that he had been tricked not by his dark priest, but by the demon. Prelati was a brilliant fraudster and a magician whose theatrical tricks absolutely enthralled Gilles de Rais and only drove him deeper into madness. By 1439, the rumours of Gilles' crimes had reached the ears of Duke Jean V of Brittany. Children had been vanishing from villages and towns associated with Gilles de Rais. Desperate parents had for years been inquiring at Gilles' castles after their missing children, and no doubt they spoke to their local priests and anyone else they thought could help. Finally, Jean V appointed the Bishop of Nantes to begin a quiet investigation into the rumours. Gilles de Rais, increasingly deranged and desperate, no longer had a public life to speak of. Although still technically a Marshal of France and one of the king's advisors, he was no longer invited to councils. As the king grew into his power, he sought to bring order to the chaos that had reigned for so long. There were still brigands roaming the countryside, and plenty of regional lords acted like bandits themselves, having grown used to the decades of decentralized power. After establishing a royal army, the king had no more need for warlords like Gilles de Rais to supply his soldiers, and instead the lords who won his favour would be those who aligned with and delivered his policies. In 1439, Gilles received a visit by the young Dauphin Louis, who would one day become King Louis XI. One of his nicknames would be the Universal Spider, because he was always spinning webs of plots and conspiracies, and he was effective at statecraft even as a teenager. The Dauphin arrested one of Gilles de Rais' captains and had him thrown into a dungeon. This minor noble and his crimes of banditry were not important. This was a warning to Gilles de Rais to stop his own raiding and provided an example of the king's power. This rattled Gilles, who fled to his castles in Brittany. It was around this time that Gilles' priest Blanchet abandoned his master and ran away. He had procured alchemists for his lord, but he was disturbed by the conjurations and the other rumours. Indeed, he heard from one of Gilles' men that rumours were spreading that their master was killing children and practicing magic, so Blanchet ran. But the man knew too much, and Gilles was no doubt afraid that he would tell the authorities what had been going on. The Baron sent his men to hunt down the fugitive priest. They captured him and dragged him back. No doubt feeling the forces being arrayed against him, Gilles was reaching a crisis point. He had been drinking heavily for years and was falling regularly into bouts of depression. He had driven away all his allies and was surrounded only by sycophants as evil as himself. He spent his days dealing with money problems, alchemical experiments, and desperate conjurations. His nights he spent in far darker crimes as the killings continued. If anything, they increased in frequency. At Easter 1440, he attended a local church and even made his confession to the priest, although whether he admitted the extent of his crimes we don't know. When it was time to receive the sacraments, the Baron humbly waited his turn amongst the common folk. Whether this was a typically theatrical display of piety for the sake of public relations, or if he was experiencing a burst of contrition, is hard to say. He even, at this time, swore that he would go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land to cleanse his soul, but he never did. At his trial, he would claim to have always been a good Christian, and perhaps as he grew increasingly desperate, he did consider the path of virtue. If so, it would not last. Just a few weeks later at Whitsun, he would commit a public outrage that forced the authorities to act. He decided to take back a castle that he had sold to Geoffroy Le Ferron, who happened to be the treasurer to Duke Jean V. The keys to the castle were held by Jean Le Ferron, Geoffroy's brother, who was also the priest at the village church. He was looking after the castle for his brother, whose work required him to be with the Duke. Gilles took a company of 60 soldiers and positioned them in the woods around the church. When the mass was over and most of the congregation had left, Gilles marched into the church with a polearm, shouting, "You thieving scoundrel, you have beaten my men and extorted money from them. Come outside the church or I'll lay you out dead." Jean Le Ferron either walked out or was dragged out and was then forced to his knees. Given the choice to hand over his keys or lose his head, the priest did as he was ordered and was soon thrown into a dungeon. Gilles took possession of the castle and was presumably feeling pleased with himself. But this time he had gone too far. Geoffroy Le Ferron was not only the rightful legal owner of the castle, he was part of the Duke's household. This was therefore an attack on the Duke himself. On top of the rumours that were widely circulating, the Duke finally acted and fined Gilles 50,000 crowns for his transgression. This was an impossibly large fine. To pay it, he would have to sell everything that he had left. It was meant to destroy him. At the same time, the Duke also instructed his Chancellor, the Bishop of Nantes, to begin an official inquiry into the murders. The bishop and his agents began interviewing and recording evidence from parents who had lost their children. Considering the details included on the indictment, it is also likely that he obtained unrecorded testimony from someone in the Lord's household who was privy to the crimes. Probably Blanchet, possibly one of the cousins, or the choir boys, or more than one person. Gilles had nowhere left to turn, and he gave up without a fight. His accomplices, the alchemist priest Prelati, the priest who had tried to escape Blanchet, and the servants Poitou and Henriette were arrested with him. The Baron's cousins, Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Briqueville, had already left the household and were not arrested, despite their part in the crimes. The prisoners were taken to Nantes. Soon thereafter began the shocking trials of Gilles de Rais. There were 2 inquiries and 2 trials, one ecclesiastical and one secular, both held on different floors of the castle. The Bishop of Nantes was also Chancellor to the Duke of Brittany, and so was able to oversee both trials. Between the preliminary hearings and the sentencing, the trials took about 6 weeks. At first, Gilles was cooperative, recognising the authority of the courts. Then he was held in custody for about 3 weeks, while the courts held evidence hearings and took further witness statements. The next time he was brought to court to hear the full charges read, he understood for the first time what a weight of evidence had been gathered against him. He reacted explosively, rejecting the charges as frivolous and denying the accusations outright. He also refused 4 times to take an oath that was necessary for the trial proper to begin. 2 days later, they began the public trial anyway. Up until now, everything had occurred behind closed doors, but now most of the local nobility packed themselves into the hall, keen to hear the horrific details. First, the formal indictment of 49 paragraphs was read out. It's a long list of the events, heresies and crimes, and it's sometimes inaccurate and contradictory, with a confused chronology. The first part goes to great lengths to establish the legitimacy of the court and its right to prosecute the accused under the law. They wanted to do everything right, especially if the king ever challenged their authority. The rest describes the acts of demon summoning, abductions, sodomy, murders, and the covering up of these crimes through disposing of the bodies. Witnesses from Gilles' household described in horrific detail how these things were done, and how the servants had been tasked to burn the bodies and dispose of the ashes. They even described clearing the piles of remains from castles that had been sold before the new owners took possession of them. It must have taken a long time to read out the charges. When asked if he wished to respond, Gilles answered with vanity and arrogance that he would not. Then he asserted that his judges had no authority over him and that they were, quote, thieving rogues who took bribes, and that he would rather be hanged than he should answer their questions, and that it was intolerable that he should be brought before them, end quote. He continued to strongly object for the rest of the hearing. He was told he was in contempt of court, and then he was formally excommunicated from the church. Immediately he appealed and was denied. Still, he would not cooperate with the court. The authorities gave him 2 days to reconsider and adjourned. Then something happened. We don't know what it was or how it happened, but when he appeared back in court 2 days later, he was a changed man. He recognized the authority of the court, admitted the charges in the indictment except those related to demon summoning, and even asked the judge's pardon for his insults and hurtful words. So why this change of heart? Did someone with great power get to him in private and threaten him with something worse than death? Did a priest convince him to repent? No doubt people had been pressuring him, but perhaps he had a realization alone in the dark of the night. It's possible he saw that this was his last opportunity to choose virtue over sin. However it happened, he gave in, and the trial could proceed. In public now, over the next few days, Gilles' servants related how they had procured victims for their master and cleaned up afterwards, and all else they had witnessed over the years. When finally it came time for Gilles to comment on the evidence heard thus far, he refused. He had relapsed into surly obstruction. It was then that the prosecutor suggested the accused should be put to the question. That is, he was to be tortured to elicit answers. Because the charges included heresy, the court had been assisted by the local representative of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an institution of the Catholic Church that guarded against heresy. They not only conducted trials of suspected heretics, but were authorized to use torture under certain circumstances to extract confessions. So the next morning, Gilles was brought to the castle to be tortured. But on arrival, perhaps on seeing the implements by which he was to be tortured, he asked if he might instead confess to his crimes. The authorities granted his request, and that afternoon the officers of the court went to Gilles' rooms in the tower where he was being held. Technically, this was an out-of-court confession, but it was recorded. As he recounted his crimes, the chief judge was confused about why he had committed the murders. All he could imagine was that they were related to the demon summoning, that they were human sacrifices. Who persuaded you and taught you how to commit these crimes, he asked. Gilles insisted that he had done them according to his own imagination and ideas, without anyone's counsel, and following his own feelings solely for his own pleasure and carnal delight. The judge simply had no concept of a serial killer and insisted on having an explanation. Gilles replied, "Alas, sir, you torment yourself and me along with you." To this the judge said, "I don't torment myself in the least, but I'm very surprised at what you've told me and simply cannot be satisfied with it. I desire and would like to know the absolute truth from you." Gilles said, "Truly, there was no other cause, no other end nor intention, if not what I've told you. I've told you greater things than this and enough to kill 10,000 men. Still confused, the judges ordered the alchemist Francois Prelati to be brought to the room. When he arrived, they asked him to confirm whether the murders were offers for the demons. Prelati admitted that on one occasion only he was supplied with the hand, heart and eyes of a child by Gilles de Rais in order to offer them to the demon, but also that the demon never turned up. As Prelati was led away again, Gilles cried out in tears and gasps, "Goodbye, Francois, my friend. Never again shall we see each other in this world. I pray that God gives you plenty of patience and understanding, and be sure, provided you have plenty of patience and trust in God, we will meet again in the great joy of paradise. Pray to God for me, and I will pray for you." Upon which saying, he embraced Prelati, and the man was taken away. Prelati made no response that was recorded, but we can imagine the cynical charlatan was not likewise moved to such self-pitying tears. The next day, Gilles de Rais made a full confession in front of the whole court. It was to be a final theatrical performance where he was playing the part of a contrite, penitent man looking for salvation. Perhaps it was heartfelt, but I'm not inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, because his long recounting of his crimes was infused with narcissism and self-pity as he laid the blame on his spoiled upbringing. He urged all those people present to be strict with their own children, to keep watch over them, so that they were not too finely dressed and to not allow them to live in idleness, claiming that many evils arose from laziness and excesses at table. On the surface, he was, astonishingly, daring to give parenting advice, ostensibly so that others would not turn out like he had, but his words conveyed his true feelings. Despite his supposed contrition and his desire to die as a good Christian, he was still not accepting the blame for his actions. He believed first his parents and then his grandfather were ultimately at fault for not being stricter with him as a child. No doubt there's at least some truth to that, but it seems to me that his supposed penitence was false. His servants Poitou and Henriette also repeated in the secular court the confessions they had made at the ecclesiastical court. Then all three men were sentenced to be hanged and burned. Gilles had been excommunicated, but after cooperating with the courts, he had been readmitted into the church, and the day before the executions, he was allowed to make confession to a priest. He also requested that he be the first one of the three to die, his reason being so that he might set a good example, seeing that it was he who had led them into the crimes, and also so that they could see he would not escape punishment. In view of his supposed contrition and cooperative attitude, the court also granted that his body would not be burned to ashes as had been ordered. Instead, his body would only be briefly touched to the flames before being given a proper Christian burial in Nantes. He also requested that the bishop and his clergy should walk in solemn procession to the place of execution, so that he and his servants might be kept in hope of salvation. Some biographers have wondered if all this cooperation was to enact this final concession. The only thing he had left was his immortal soul. The only thing that frightened him now was the devil coming to claim him from the flames. Seen in this light, his eager cooperation was also a cynical, narcissistic attempt to avoid eternal punishment. The procession from the castle to the place of execution, in a meadow on an island in the Loire, began at 9 o'clock in the morning. Jean Benedetti says, quote, "It was impressive and moving, with all the splendour of ritual and music that the church could offer. It was yet more theatre," end quote. And right to the end he maintained his performance as a pious, contrite Christian. When they were standing on the platforms, with the gibbets overhead and the faggots beneath, Gilles de Rais spoke loudly and at length to his servants on the subject of the salvation of their souls, urging them to be strong and virtuous in the face of diabolical temptations. After praying loudly and at length on his knees, he was finally hoisted up by the neck and hanged until he was dead. His body was lowered to the flames beneath for a short time before it was placed in a coffin and buried in a nearby church. His servants were hanged and their bodies burned to ashes and scattered. Despite all the evil he had done, he had gotten off rather lightly. Still, at least he had been caught, tried, and his evil put once and for all to an end. But what about those who claimed that this whole trial was nothing more than a conspiracy by the Baron's enemies? Was Gilles de Rais innocent? In 1992, an informal retrial of Gilles de Rais took place in the French Senate, where a jury of politicians, historians and former ministers acquitted the Baron after hearing arguments for his rehabilitation. This verdict carried no legal weight, but it has been influential. So much so that many articles and documentaries about Gilles de Rais today conclude by saying that he was in fact an innocent man. So why do they say this? Well, after his death, the legal squabbles over his estate continued for generations. Most of those who had been associated with him before his downfall, including the king, wished to forget him entirely. Charles VII owed his kingdom at least to some degree to Joan of Arc and those that supported her. It was an embarrassment, even shameful, that Joan was a convicted heretic and her conviction cast a shadow over the crown. A retrial was held in 1456 where Joan was found innocent and she was eventually made a saint in 1920. Gilles de Rais was likewise a supporter of the Dauphin's cause, and although he was more easily ignored, his conviction reflected poorly on the king. And there's the lingering sense that Gilles and Joan's stories are entwined enough that the innocence or guilt of one should reflect on the other. Still, the horror of his crimes passed into legend, and he was written about intermittently ever since. At some point, the folk story about Bluebeard came to be associated with Gilles de Rais. You'll often see it said that Gilles de Rais inspired the folk story, and even that he was the real Bluebeard. But Bluebeard is a story about a wealthy nobleman who kills one wife after another. The story begins when Bluebeard obtains a new wife and then must go away on business, leaving her with a key to every door in the castle. He warns her that she can go anywhere other than one specific room. Overcome with curiosity, she opens the room and finds it filled with the blood and corpses of the previous wives. The key becomes stained with blood that can't be washed off. The most important features of this folk story form are the castle, the evil owner who has to leave, the magic key that opens every door that the curious hero is entrusted with, and the evidence that can't be wiped clean. In other variants of this story, the castle belongs to a witch, and the hero entrusted with a key and warned never to open a specific room is the virtuous character Petit Jean. Clearly, therefore, this was a separate story tradition that came to be associated with Gilles de Rais at a later date, especially thanks to the efforts of one 19th century author. And most authors in the centuries after his death enjoyed playing up the horrors of the story, in the process adding their own dark twists to the mythology. These inventions came to be repeated by later writers and are often reported as facts today in articles and documentary films. For example, there's the myth that Gilles de Rais owned in his library an illustrated copy of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius and was inspired by the brutal perversions of Caligula and Nero. The number of victims has also continuously been inflated. So how many victims were there? Well, we don't actually know. From the witness statements of parents of named missing children, or at least their family name, and other witness statements, the number seems to be around 40. The confessions also recount two events where between 36 and 46 bodies were removed from two different castles to stop them being discovered. If both those events happened, that would make for around 80 victims. The trial elsewhere claims there were 140. Where we see numbers like 600 and 800, these are completely made up. The many inconsistencies in the trial records generally are considered by some to be evidence for Gilles de Rais' innocence. The main thrust of the argument is that Gilles de Rais was the victim of a conspiracy led by John V, the Duke of Brittany. Gilles de Rais was allied more with King Charles and his faction, whereas the Duke historically had favoured the English, so the motivation was partly political, but the goal was for the Duke to seize all of Gilles de Rais' great wealth and to distribute it to the Duke's vassals, thereby strengthening his own faction while weakening that of the crown. The argument for his innocence is put forward best in the book The Martyrdom of Gilles de Rais by Margot K. Juby. She also runs the website Gilles de Rais Was Innocent. Links to both are in the video description. The book strips away the centuries of myths by examining the original sources with a critical eye. Juby believes Gilles de Rais committed no murders, that there were no murders at all, and argues that the confessions were all extracted under torture, with the details fed to them or falsely recorded. Arguments for this are based on discrepancies and contradictions in the confessions and trial records. She also finds many of the specific claims preposterous, especially the stories of Gilles de Rais keeping the bodies for years in his busy castles without them being discovered or the smell detected. She points out that there was no forensic evidence presented at the trial, no hard evidence of any kind, and she suggests the parents of missing children who gave evidence could have been bribed or were simply looking for someone to blame. The author believes there were less than 40 children listed as possible victims from all Gilles de Rais lands over a decade. And, she says, this was no higher a rate than normal for war-torn medieval France. It's a very worthwhile study, and I have no doubt that it served John V very well to destroy Gilles de Rais and enrich his own vassals in the process. But I find none of the arguments about Gilles' innocence convincing. There is no evidence that torture was used on the servants. Contradictory witness statements are perfectly common in trials as people misremember events from years before. In this case, the guilty servants and priests also tried to play down their own involvement in certain crimes, leading to contradictions. As for the lack of human remains, the witnesses claim to have burned the bodies and disposed of the ashes. Today there would be detailed forensic investigations, but the judges here had no way to find trace evidence, and they had no need to. There are multiple accounts from named witnesses who give specific details about their children being given over into the care of Gilles de Rais or his agents and never being seen again. The hoarding of the remains may seem baffling or even ludicrous, but we know of modern cases where this was done in a suburban home rather than a castle. And ultimately we have the confessions of Gilles de Rais and his servants. There is no evidence that they were obtained under torture, other than personal incredulity that they were freely given. The evidence was so overwhelming to the courts that they did not need to be any more meticulous than they were. To me, the patterns of behaviour are clear. He was rash, impulsive, emotional and narcissistic. Despite his education and martial ability, he also does not seem to have been especially bright. Certainly he seems driven by self-destructive tendencies that he occasionally struggled with but always gave way to. Like other serial killers, there were moments of relative peace punctuated by frenzies of killing that burned themselves out. There were moments where he was stricken with feelings of guilt and self-pity, but he thrust those aside and sought solace in his crimes. Some people have looked for answers as to why he committed these crimes, pointing to the loss of his parents in his childhood, the bad influence of his grandfather and so on, but that kind of speculation seems fruitless. and we can certainly appreciate the unique circumstances that allowed him to get away with his crimes for so long, such as the decades of war that left his lands in disorder and the weak leaders who failed to stop him earlier. But although it took too long, the authorities did use the law to bring him to justice and put a stop to his evil. Of course, none of us need to be told not to commit the kind of crimes he was guilty of, but to me, Gilles de Rais stands as an example of a man who repeatedly chose sin instead of virtue in every aspect of his life as he spiraled into self-destruction. He stands as a counterpoint, the dark shadow of virtuous knights who embodied the chivalric virtues. If you'd like to see a video about one of these knights in particular, William the Marshal, then please subscribe to the channel now, as I'll be telling that story in future. In the meantime, please watch this video about another virtuous man who travelled halfway around the world on a mission of peace. Thank you for watching.